Imagine waking up tomorrow and your entire cultural and linguistic foundation is just shattered overnight. Well, that's exactly what happened to the English language in the 11th century. We are plunging straight into the Middle English period. It's a chaotic, volatile, but absolutely fascinating era of survival and synthesis. This isn't just some dry chapter in a history book. It's the wild story of how a localized Germanic tongue literally collided with an invading Romance language to forge the incredibly complex, expressive vocabulary that we still use to communicate today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Norman Conquest, 1066. How did it change English literature? How exactly does a military invasion rewrite the very DNA of a country's art and speech? That's the central mystery we're unraveling here. And it goes way beyond a simple regime change where a new monarch just sits on a throne. This was a profound, deeply ingrained cultural friction between the established Anglo-Saxons and the invading Normans. The literature of the era reflects a society fractured right down the middle, struggling to find a unified voice while navigating a totally new social hierarchy imposed by foreign conquerors.
To really grasp the sheer scale of this transformation, we have to establish our historical bookends. The Middle English period runs strictly from 1066 to 1485. The year 1066 marks the brutal, decisive end of Anglo-Saxon supremacy. Fast forward 4 centuries, and 1485 marks the dawn of the Tudor dynasty and the close of the incredibly bloody Wars of the Roses. Between these two monumental dates lies a crucible of roughly 400 years where the native English language was essentially forced underground, only to slowly, painstakingly climb its way back to dominance, completely altered from its original form.
Let's start with that initial shock to the system. 1066. William the Conqueror crosses the English Channel, and the resulting Battle of Hastings, well, it isn't just a military victory. It is a total decapitation of the English ruling class. Overnight, the people running the country, commanding the military, managing the church, and presiding over the courts, they no longer spoke English. The highest echelons of society were instantly replaced by a francophone elite, setting off a massive linguistic earthquake that fundamentally disrupted the trajectory of the entire island. The Norman Conquest brought massive French influence into English language and literature. The conquerors brought Old Norman French with them, and it immediately became the language of power, prestige, and administration. Meanwhile, Old English, the language of Beowulf, was relegated to the subjugated classes. For generations, an English peasant laboring in the fields and a Norman lord feasting in the Great Hall quite literally could not understand one another. If you wanted to practice law, engage in international trade, or move up in the royal court, you had to speak French. English survived, sure, but strictly as an oral language among the commoners, totally untethered from formal education or elite literature.
And this brilliantly illustrates the severe sociolinguistic divide that was created. It wasn't some peaceful sharing of culture, it was a strict, rigid hierarchy. And the truly fascinating part is that this hierarchy is still baked right into our modern vocabulary today. Think about the animals on a medieval farm. The Anglo-Saxon commoners were the ones raising the livestock, giving us the earthy Germanic words we still use: cow, sheep, and swine. But the French-speaking nobility, they only interacted with those animals when they were served up at grand banquets, giving us the culinary terms derived from French: beef, mutton, and pork.
Over the centuries, these two distinct forces didn't just sit side by side. They underwent a profound, incredibly messy fusion. English plus French equals the Middle English language. Because English was largely cut off from formal schooling, its strict, complicated grammatical rules began to erode. The complex word endings of Old English dropped away, stripping the syntax down to something much leaner and heavily reliant on word order. At the exact same time, thousands of French words flooded into the lexicon. The result was Middle English, a language boasting an absolutely massive vocabulary full of rich synonyms. A writer could now choose to ask for forgiveness, a Germanic root, or pardon, a French one. They could feel hearty, which is English, or cordial, which is French. It gave the literature of the time unparalleled nuance.
Let's move to 1485 and see how this builds. As we traverse the centuries following the conquest, through the absolute devastation of the Black Death and the long, bitter 100 Years' War against France, the Anglo-Norman nobility gradually lost their continental territories. They were forced to fully identify as English, and because of that, the language surged back into the courts and literature, championed by heavy-hitting writers like Geoffrey Chaucer. This centuries-long evolution brings us right up to our culmination point, the late 15th century.
This specific, transformative linguistic era officially and definitively comes to a close with the Tudor accession in 1485. Now, the Tudors brought much-needed political stability to England, but an even more massive technological shift had just arrived on the scene. William Caxton introduced the printing press to England in 1476. Suddenly, the wild, highly regional dialects of Middle English had to be standardized so books could be sold widely from London all the way to Yorkshire. Concurrently, a crazy phenomenon known as the Great Vowel Shift was radically altering how words were actually pronounced. Together, the printing press and this phonetic shift locked the written word into place, effectively closing the book on the fluid, evolving Middle English period and ushering in the early modern English that Shakespeare would very soon inherit.
So, how did the 1066 linguistic mix forever alter the trajectory of the English language? It's wild to think about how one single historical event permanently shaped a global language. The next time you write an email, read a novel, or even just speak to a friend, look closely at the words you're choosing. You are actively conjuring the ghosts of Anglo-Saxon farmers and Norman kings forced together by history to create a uniquely layered, incredibly expressive global powerhouse of a language. It completely reframes the way we think about the very words coming out of our mouths